You ready? All right, if we could reconvene. We've already had the IPS turnaround update, so we're ready for our InTAS report. We have Sarah P., Sandy Cole, and Hardy Murphy up. If you don't mind, we'll continue to eat while you present.
Go ahead and eat while we talk. It's all right. I do smell it, though. I just want you to know. Smelling your food. Thank you for having us back again to give you a report on the research that you all have funded for us. I want to start just by saying Sarah Pease is not here. She trusted Dr. Murphy and I to do this presentation without her, and she's actually tied up with another event that we have at the center.
Sandy, before you start, I'd like to say something. I'm not going to talk long, but this is important because I don't know, you guys often get the kind of information that think public service thrives upon. We all have Mr. Point. You should have seen the look and those students' eyes that were here from the Christian Academy. When you took that vote, and I just turned around and looked at it, you should have seen the sparkle in their eyes. And I never even said to one of their staff members or parent, I said, you know, what these students learned today, that American democracy works when you're able to go and present your case to people who are elected to make decisions that are in the best interest of its community, schools, and its students. Every one of those children walked out of here with a lift in their step. So, you know, I know you know this, but sometimes, you know, in the heat of it all, you kind of miss it. But, you know, you always have these takeaways where you want to say, you know, there's something that I'd like to remember and I'd like to tell. And for me, that was a defining moment to see how they reacted to that vote that you took. So I just wanted to pass that on and say thanks to you.
So we want to present to you, and we've had lots of messages to be brief, so we'll try and be brief. The purpose of the survey that we did, and I just want to, for those of you who've been around a while, we did a survey in 2014 where we measured educators' perceptions of teacher evaluation in Indiana. We came back in 2016 and we wanted to measure, using the same survey, the perceptions of educators on teacher evaluation in Indiana, so that we would have 14 and 16 comparisons to show you. Our methodology was pretty simple. We had the survey already from 2014. The survey was based on the InTAS rubric components, where we asked questions about aspects of implementation as well as process and impact. The survey was distributed through a number of professional organizations. I won't read all of those to you, but they were very helpful in distributing the survey, and it also was on the IDOE Learning Connections. Our sample size is up there. We did have a statistically valid sample, so we can say that this is a valid survey, valid analyses. The methodology for the survey, to continue, the questions were a 7-point Likert scale, so anywhere from strongly agree to strongly disagree, with neutral in the middle. We did t-test statistical analysis, and it was conducted with a 0.95 confidence interval in order to determine the significance of mean difference in item responses between the 2014 and the 2016 surveys. We also did adjustments for multiple comparisons using the 2K HSD tests. I am not a statistician. Please don't ask me to explain either of those. The survey had belief stems, or questions that had stems around beliefs and confidence. So our belief questions had stems that started with, I believe that teacher effectiveness, or I believe that student academic growth. Our confidence level questions all had question stems that started with, I am confident. So for teachers, they answered questions about whether they were confident in their evaluators. And for principals, the questions were about their own confidence in their ability to be evaluators. So those were the two different stems on the confidence level.
So, thank you, Sandy. So, what we're talking about here is a mean shift when we talk about significant changes from 2014 to 2016. However, I do think it's important to frame this so that you understand what this means in terms of the absolute responses. And if you want to, we can get to it in the discussions a little later. Because it's easy to misinterpret that this is what this is saying. So to say things that there's a mean shift where teachers are more positive is important. It's also important to understand where the absolute position is. And right now, what we see is that, unfortunately, I don't believe teachers are in a favorable position about the overall, the law, the changes, and their implementation. And there are two or three things in here that they are decidedly negative about. Some of the highlights of it, though, is that when we look at the differences between INTAS teachers and other teachers, it appears that there are some significant differences. So when you look at the distribution of responses across the different parts of that Likert scale, the mean responses become very important, but looking at the span of responses across the Likert scale is important too. So when you look at most of the teachers' responses, they fall somewhere between the 3s, the 4s, and the high 4s and 5s. So it's that middle of the scale. There are very few responses that are all the way at the very bottom and very few at the very, very top. So we're actually talking about these mean differences across these items. And when you look at those items, 30 of the 40 responses from INTAS teachers are 4.5 and above. And that's pretty good when you look at the fact that that means you're moving up above somewhat agree into the agree range. And for non-INTAS teachers, that's 7 out of the 40 items, the questions. So when you look at this, INTAS is also higher in the distribution of significantly different items that have improved. When you look at principals overall, 30 of the 40 principals' responses are still 5 or greater, and 5 of the superintendents, 10 of the 18 of 5 are greater. But as we go through this, you're going to see there's been a significant shift in the direction of the superintendent's movement. So now let's get to the general shift. So a significant and positive mean change occurred in 17 of 18 questions related to beliefs, and a significant and positive change in all of the questions related to confidence occurred with teachers, and with the principals, we had significant and positive mean changes in 5 of the 18 belief questions, and significant and negative mean changes for 3 questions related to their confidence in themselves as evaluators. Superintendents is kind of a different story. Superintendents had a significant change. It was significant and negative related to beliefs about the evaluation system. So overall, the favorability of teachers regarding teacher evaluation increased in the 2016 survey. But as I said, you've got to be careful with that, because in general, they are not in a favorable position. When you look at the principal favorability, it's essentially unchanged. Superintendent's favorability decreased, so much so that principals are now the group with the most favorable viewpoint of the new educator evaluation requirements. I have my own feelings and interpretations about that, and if you want to discuss it, we can talk about that.
Can I add something? So if you look at this slide, what we're saying is that teachers moved in a favorable, positive direction, but they still are not positive about teacher evaluation. Principals principals did not change, however, they are still positive, and superintendents went down in their favorability, but they still are positive, just as a context.
With 2 exceptions.
Yes.
And those 2 exceptions are about their confidence in the fact that this law is going to make a difference, the right kind of difference, and their confidence in whether or not they think it's making a difference in their school districts. And if you have to put this all in the context of what this is happening in terms of the feedback they're getting in terms of student performance on the state assessments. That's really what I think feeds at the superintendent level and what they feel when they manage all of this in terms of the climate and their individual district school cultures. So when you look at it in terms of the INTAS and the non-INTAS districts, in terms of this whole idea of what does it mean to ensure that people are engaged in a kind of a collaborative process of making change and deciding what to do, you'll see that with those districts that have been through this process, including everyone at the table, making sure that all the communications are getting out there in terms of what the change is, and being a part of defining how that change is going to be implemented, you'll see that teachers from those districts that have been involved in that at INTAS are significantly more positive than those in non-INTAS districts in 37 and 42 questions. When you look at the teacher responses from those districts that we've been working with on this process, they're more favorable in 15 out of belief questions and 21 of 20. 23 questions. Now, INTAS principal mean responses are significantly more positive than non-INTAS principals for 22 of the 42 questions, and the superintendents are significantly more positive than non-INTAS superintendents in 10 of the 29 questions.
And we actually did the survey this time by being able to disaggregate INTAS districts from non-INTAS, but we want to just make a note here that we have over 18 districts that have been working with us over 4 years, but we selected the survey to be sent only to the 10 districts who started with us in 2012, so that we would have districts who had at least 4 years with us.
One of the things we found was consistent with previous surveys that years of experience appears to make a difference. When you look at the teachers that have the least amount of years, they seem to be the ones that have the most favorable impression and view of the evaluation systems. Those patterns are the same as the ones we found in 16. In 14, we found them in 16. And the least favorable survey responses happen to be teachers having 25 years experience or 25 years plus experience. So there are some other things that, that we found that were interesting, and I see you guys prevail on this one. The word I debated was whether or not that should be permanency, and in the dictionary you can see that that's not even included in the dictionary sometimes, but we went with rurality. So urban teachers are much less positive in general when teacher evaluation changes than suburban and rural. So when you look at what does all this mean in terms of discussion points? Ultimately, you see that superintendents are still the most favorable, not anymore, but principals are the most favorable now, whereas superintendents were in 14. And in 16, there's a shift towards a more positive view of the changes. It looks like this improvement is driven most of all by confidence that teachers have in their evaluators and the process of evaluation. But there is a big three, and they're related to all these factors that we found in the 2014 survey. Questions related to linking compensation and student growth to evaluation across the survey administrations show that teachers, principals, and superintendents are still not favorable. They're all on the same page with that. And teachers don't believe the changes in teacher evaluation have improved teaching and learning in their districts. Superintendents are pretty much in that same place also. So, as we go through this, we have our own feelings about why much of this is happening, and so what are the big takeaways that you take away from all of this? And there's some important things. And one is that when you look at it, teachers are significantly more agreeable and have more confidence in a number of questions involving their evaluation experiences and the capability of their evaluators. But the numbers of years of experience, the type of district makes a difference. And when you'll remember that part of the research we did the last time we were here was that we showed you that there was a real correlation between teacher evaluations and the percentages of students they had on free and reduced lunch in their classroom. So when you see that kind of relationship with evaluations, then this kind of view is also explainable. The teachers in those districts where you have the highest percentage of students on free and reduced lunch are the least favorable ones of these teacher evaluation mechanisms. We also have identified there seems to be a continuous experience that if you include teachers in the process of developing and in the implementation process, quit having them at the table trying to work it out and figure out things that are going well and how to improve them, they tend to have a more favorable view of the process, and that's kind of what the INTAS process is.
So we ended the report with some recommendations, and I know some of these are going to sound like we're a broken record because you've heard us say this probably every time we've stood in front of you, but I think the survey and the comparison between 14 and 16 continues to underline our research over time. One is we want to continue to ensure that the a continuous improvement process to support the implementation teacher evaluation plans with fidelity and provide resources to districts to make it happen. This is this whole concept that, you know, the districts who have included teachers, the teachers who have done it well, or the districts who have done it well, the districts where there has been a continuous focus on purpose, and the purpose being about supporting teachers, those have higher fidelity of implementation and better plans, and we want to continue to encourage that. We also want to continue to research the educator perceptions of teacher evaluation in Indiana. I think that probably coming back in 2018, issuing the survey again will give us a continuous look at evaluation over time. We'd like to continue to recognize plan quality through the INTAS and Indiana Department of Ed State Board recognition process, and we will be bringing another district to you yet in the next couple of months. We would continue to require the annual training of teachers as well as administrators in the evaluation process, because we know that if you understand the process and you understand how it's going to impact you, that in fact you're probably going to have a more favorable view of what is happening to you in the evaluation process. This is one that we have debated and certainly discussed with many of you as well as legislators over time, and really based on 14-16 survey and the fact that these two questions related, or the question related to compensation has not changed in terms of favorability. We would recommend that, and we know this is not your purview, but that the link to compensation be reviewed and possibly revised, because that is the question on the survey. If you look at the means and the data that you see is the lowest across every single educator group. We would like to clearly express the role and significance of a supportive teacher evaluation process and educator effectiveness in school improvement. We think that as we move forward in this era of accountability, and regardless of what decisions the legislature makes on teacher evaluation in terms of moving forward, that if we can continue to look at teacher evaluation in the context of school improvement and a way to engage teachers and support teachers for school improvement, that is the direction moving forward. And we would like to reframe the message of teacher evaluation so that teachers and evaluators see it as a tool for ensuring the success of teachers and students in the teaching and learning process. We have acknowledgments of people who have helped us with this survey, and I just want to add another note here on behalf of both Hardy and I. Through the State Board grant, we've really been able to provide the board with a body of research on teacher evaluation, and that research has included the two surveys. We did an extensive plan review and analysis of what plans look like in the state, and recently we submitted the 4-year analysis of teacher evaluation to you. It has resulted, we think, in a better understanding of teacher evaluation in Indiana, its implementation, and its impact. And it would have been much more difficult for us to do that without board support. So we appreciate it. We just want to say thank you.
Yeah. And so there are some big takeaways. You know, one of the big takeaways is that we documented something that I think many people knew. There's a lot of inconsistency in plan implementation and quality. And where it's done well, it appears to make a difference. I think we answered some other questions that were important. Remember the raging debate about what's the right weight? I'm not sure there is a right weight. When we looked into it, there was some evidence early on that there was a sweet spot, but then it became like the will-o'-the-wisp as we tried to control for all the variables that could impact it. And I do think that this whole idea of how you use growth in an evaluation system is an important one. And one of the things we hit upon, we think it's worth exploring, is that we know that when teachers across the state look at their classrooms and their IGM ratings, those discrepancies that we documented, we know that they feel that it's not fair to compare classrooms that have differing demographics. And that perhaps a system where teachers are looked at in terms of how they compare against peers with like classrooms is one way to have this conversation in such a way, because you have to assume that the commitment for teachers there is to do the right thing every day they're in a classroom. So to say to them, this is what you look like when you compare yourself against your peers, is a very different thing to say to them, this is what you look like against everybody in the state, because you fall into the trap of, but my classroom is different and you're comparing me against people who don't have the kind of challenges that I have. The other thing, and probably the final thing and the biggest takeaway about all of this with the law and its intent, is that teachers and principals and superintendents are now engaged in this process of trying to define and implement high-quality evaluation through conversations that make a difference and a rich dialogue about student learning outcomes and supporting teachers in a way that I'm not sure was occurring in such a systematic fashion as before. The idea of research-based rubrics being used is a significant change and a good one. So I see those as positive takeaways and fuel for further discussion about this very important topic. Thank you.
Thank you for all your hard work, and we are very grateful for what you do and help inform us as we make decisions on these very important issues. I think teacher evaluation is a topic that will continue to be top of mind for the board, and as we think about future recommendations to the legislature, I think that's something that you can help inform us and guide us going forward. So thank you for what you do, and thank you for being here.
I have one quick question. And you may not have the answer to this, but you alluded to both earlier. You said that those schools with the highest numbers of free and reduced had the most dismal reviews of the teacher evaluation program.
I didn't say dismal. I said there is a difference where you see
Most
those
more negative than the others. I think.
those teachers more frequently have evaluations that are lower than teachers in schools with fewer.
Was there a
IGM
link? Was there a link between the student outcome portion of their evaluation and
Yes, there
the
was discrepancies.
review?
We
I
did-
guess is what that's where I'm headed to.
Yes. So when you look at the interrelationship of all these experiences that we've had, remember there was a great deal of apprehension. So there was a shift. Not all teachers are being evaluated as highly effective, but they are falling pretty much in the effective and highly effective range. So in some ways, the sky didn't fall in. Additionally, even though people don't like the fact that it is linked to compensation, that impacted very few teachers. So in some sense, when you look at the fact that the worst did not happen, all of a sudden, this is rather cynical, but I don't mean it that way, then I think people can be more reflective about what is going on, because principals, on the other hand, now are engaged with teachers. So to answer your question, if you are a teacher and you're in a classroom that has a high percentage of students on free and reduced lunch, then you're more likely to have a lower IGM rating than a teacher who's in a classroom with fewer students on free and reduced lunch. And that is also where we saw the greatest discrepancy between the ultimate summative rating of the teacher and the IGM ratings of those teachers. It took me a long time to say yes.
You're asking a professor to give an answer.
But BJ, I think, I know you and I have talked about this a little bit too. So what we found was that the IGM ratings for teachers who had the demographics of students who are on free and reduced lunch, in many of those districts, you will also see a low percentage or a low weight on student data. Right, so
And that's always been my fear. I mean,
Yeah.
is if we want people to take accepting the challenge of going into those schools with more challenges, the higher that weight is, the less incentive
Which, I'm not going to belabor the point. I know you guys are ready to be done with all of this. But it does mean that the conversation about growth should be reframed. And so it may not be that the conversation is to use growth or not, or to use IGM or not. It may be the conversation is what is the best way to use it. And that's not a conversation we're having right now. Right now the debate is yes or no in terms of using it at all. But we all know that just from a logical standpoint, how student outcomes ought to make a difference in the evaluation process. The question is the best way to measure them and how you incorporate that into a decision so that teachers see it as a constructive conversation.
Thanks for your great work over many years. Has it been 2 or 3 years? 5?
14, 15, 16.
Okay, so multiple years. And I'll be brief with my question. Those schools who worked with you on this project, obviously, it's a much better experience for the teacher and the teacher evaluation process. And so from a state policy level, I'd like to see every school participate in your modules and your training and so forth and so on. And so my question deals with how do we scale this up to many more school districts in Indiana? What you have is really good, but I think we need to affect more schools and school corporations. Have you thought about ways to scale this up in a meaningful way?
I have, but I'm sure Sandy.
Now we'll see if we really agree, right? Actually, we've discussed it, the two of us. We've had discussions with the DOE. We've had discussions certainly with legislators. And we have presented our ideas in an action plan format to the DOE. One of the things that we believe there's like the low-hanging fruit, and then there's like, the big pot. And, just low-hanging fruit would be, what criteria needs to go into a plan beyond compliance. Simple, what's that framework? How do districts all put into their plan the kinds of things that we require and ensure that teachers are involved in the decision and the implementation and review of their plans. Low-hanging fruit, simple. Beyond that, and I think, and look at Byron on this, because I think that the next part of that is how do districts get technical assistance when the support is needed to revise or to bring teachers on board when they hadn't been on board, or to really have the discussions around growth. And that technical assistance we've been able to do as a part of the state board contract and state board work to get out to more districts. I think there are a variety of ways to think about that, but I think that's another way to scale it up. So I think in our plan to the department, we actually outlined those things that could be done fairly easily, and then those things that would take more resources.
The other question I have is we place a lot of responsibility on school principals, particularly at the elementary level. There's one principal in many schools in Indiana. Middle school, maybe you'll have an assistant principal. But then you look at large staffs where principals are doing all kinds of work, plus they need to do a great job with teacher evaluation. And have you thought about maybe the state would support on a pilot basis a cadre of external reviewers that would come into a school once a year probably to really do a summative kind of assessment for teacher candidates, and they would be well-trained and maybe go through your program, but the sense of an outsider coming in who's an expert on teacher evaluation, because not every principal can be an expert in the 50 things that he or she's doing. Have you thought about that sort of cadre of experts that we would send across the state?
Well, I can tell you that in my teacher evaluation class, it's going to start in a week, the summer intensive. That's one of the questions that's posed in the text that we use. And that issue is about the difference between formative evaluation, which is about ensuring that teachers are successful, and summative evaluation about judging whether or not that success has occurred. They're two very different processes. In the past, I've kind of not been in support of that because I felt like as the instructional leader, the principal had those responsibilities. But I've come to see things a little differently, actually, during this research. My eyes have been opened by a lot of things. And I actually can see the advantages in doing that. So when you're talking about scaling that up, the question is how someone like that, which is a good idea, could become a part of the school culture, not somebody that's jumping in and out, but someone who actually has some responsibility for working with teachers and addressing their needs and their supports, who then is coordinating that effort through the school principal. That, of course, is a budget item. And if that occurs, I would also think there should be another kind of linkage with this, Doc, and that is that at some point people have to come to the understanding that you can't engage in school improvement without teacher improvement. And teacher improvement cannot occur without effective evaluation of teachers to support and develop them. Right now, when we look at what's happening in all of the education reform and school reform, these things are always approached as if there's a new program here, there's a new program there, instead of looking at it as a coherent whole. And at the end of the day, I personally believe that school improvement cannot occur without it going through the classroom teacher. So you can bring in all these different pieces, but the most important thing is to create a structure of relationships, which might include outside evaluators, that's able to broker what it means to deliver highly effective instruction in schools.
Again, thank you for all your great work and your leadership. It's very much appreciated. Within this context, I think about teacher effectiveness and decisions that we make about teachers, principals, school leaders, as well as students and schools in general, whether it's through our accountability system and the grading system and so forth. To me, there's just one variable that is consistently ignored in accountability systems, and that is the variable of time. And one of the I think challenges that we have is we measure every school regardless of the circumstances, the demographics of those schools, the challenges those schools face, under the same accountability system, expecting all students to learn in the same amount of time. Okay? So we're going to give you 180 days, and we're going to give you 45 minutes a day, and without really taking into consideration all the other challenges that are present. I guess my question, and I'm not even looking for an answer today, but just something I'm really curious about, is when we think about teacher effectiveness, we're making a lot of decisions about teachers and their ability to move students from here to here within a very narrow amount of time. And I'm starting to think about what does that look like when we start changing that variable. I'm not talking about just rearranging the schedule of the school day. But what does it mean with respect to the way we evaluate teachers, as well as the way we measure school performance? We cannot go into, I was in a school district that BJ's in, right? and really the differences between two schools within the same school district. We're looking at schools in that district that are turnaround schools and so forth, and then you look 5 miles away and you have one of the highest performing schools in the state in the same district. The difference is that very different students and the challenges they face, but we're measuring them in the same way. And I'm wondering about teachers as well, making a lot of decisions about them, but very different demographics, very different challenges, but they have the same amount of time to help those students reach. And is there a way for us to acknowledge that and to include that as part of an accountability system, not lowering standards for some schools or teachers, having high standards, but then thinking about the variable of time? Anyway, just something I've been thinking a lot about. I wanted to get your perspective on it at some point. And
Might I respond now?
Sure.
And I will try to be brief. I do think that there's been some things that evolved that have made a difference. I actually have poured through Dr. Bettenbooner's work so many times at night that I said to myself, if I wake up in the morning and I'm debating the difference between different types of student growth percentiles over breakfast in my head, I think I'm going to go take a pill. But I do think this concept makes a difference in terms of a fair and equitable representation of student growth. Because I do believe there is a difference between this idea of the growth that occurs and standards of proficiency. I absolutely know that it takes more time to get some students to proficiency than others for a myriad of reasons that may be beyond a school's control, that should be factored into the accountability system in some way. But I think it is very important to understand that this concept of growth to proficiency is one that is worth refining so that it can at least address some of the concerns that you have. The second piece to it, I think, is looking at the quality of what happens within the time that you have. So you may have more, you know this, you may have more time, but if it is not used wisely, it simply is time not well spent, and you're not going to get the kind of results that you're looking for. So I think those things are important. Now, I'll go back to what I said earlier, just as we said the same thing about teachers, so that if you go down the list, and this is 0% poverty and this is 100% poverty, on these two extremes here. Finding another classroom where 100% of your students are on free and reduced lunch in a school where 75% of your students are on free and reduced lunch, to compare the growth in that classroom with one like it at another part of the state, instead of looking at a comparison between a school where you have 75% of the students are not on free and reduced lunch, and a classroom where 0% of the students are on free and reduced lunch. I think that's the wrong comparison to make. And I have struggled with it because I don't believe we should institutionalize lower expectations even through a statistical approach. I can't tell you that I've resolved it, but I know that it's something that has to be addressed some way.
I'm going to just add my 2 cents. From a different angle, if time is an element in learning for kids, we have to accept that time is an element in learning for teachers. And so I think that when we think about the variability that you're talking about, which I totally agree with, we have to think about not only how do we give students time to learn, but how is it we build into the systems time for teachers to learn. And it has to be used well, and usually it can be done through their own collegial interactions. Doesn't have to be an expert from the outside coming in, but we have to acknowledge that they also need time to learn in order to respond to an effective evaluation system where we're asking them to do things to get better. And so I would just add that piece. I was in a school that will be left unnamed last week on another project, a really difficult school. The principal said to me, I know that most of my kids come in and they need trauma-informed care, but my teachers need trauma-informed care. And it struck me because I'm thinking, their lives, from the time they hit that door, the adult lives, to the time they leave, is responding to kids in trauma. And I think we have to give teachers the time to learn as well about how to do the kinds of things that we may be saying to them in an evaluation they need to do. Because then I think we're really talking about school reform and school improvement. So that was my little editorial.
Thank you.
I don't think I answered the question Dr. Freitas asked as well as I could have. So if you look at scale up, it ranges from how you access information and different activities through technology to the number of people and the roles they have with providing supports to schools. So if you organize scale up through multiple components to look at what kind of training can you provide through technology, to how you develop a monitoring system that helps districts get to experiences that improve the development and implementation of their plans for teachers, you can do that on an intensive basis. There could be an array of schools and districts where it's obvious that they need more intensive personnel supports, to one where you have professional development experiences for certain kinds of districts that are provided either centrally or regionally across the state, so that you see that the monitoring and supports that are identified in this process range from the intensive to the less intensive. I think you'd have to put together a budget with people and experiences to make that happen.
I can just respond a little bit to the time piece, and what that really makes me think about is the need for support of our teachers, and the difficulty when you're an administrator to evaluate and support a teacher in a way that the teachers are willing to take risks and they're not punished for trying to be innovative. And so as I think about evaluation systems, I'd like to see something that rewards teachers for taking risks and separates the role of the principal as an evaluator and supporter in a way that works for teachers.
Right. I agree.
Just to follow up on that comment, it gets to the issue of formative and summative. And I believe that it needs to be two different people. The formative person is the nurturing person who will allow for risk. And it's the person that you confide in to improve the practice of teaching. The summative person is more of making that decision, are you meeting district standards or state standards? And so I think we've been going down the road nationally, and Indiana is an example of that, where we have the same person trying to do formative and summative. That's why I'm trying to think of a way to divide it. The formative part seems to be the on-site principal who's there every day doing the walk-arounds, talking, mentoring, providing risk-taking opportunities. And the summative I see as an outside person who's not engaged in the day-to-day culture, who would have expertise in teacher evaluation, who would come into a school and then be like a doctor, write out a script. These are the things that I've seen that you're doing really well. These are some things you need to work on, and here are some things you can do. And then that would be passed to the teacher and the principal at the site to work on those formative kinds of things. And so I think it's a new model, a new national model that we should at least look at and maybe try as a pilot.
One other thing I would include with that, because I do think that that is intriguing, and we've been discussing this concept. One of the first places that we uttered it was out at Dr. Ernst's school. We talked about this concept of an instructional partnership. And in an instructional partnership, Dr. Freitas, then how the teachers do, how Harder Murphy does as a teacher, is also reflected in how you do. Because then it changes that relationship somewhat to what I'm responsible for is providing support as well as supervision and direction. How to integrate that into an overall accountability system where you look at the performance of the district, the school, and the classroom is the challenge, as you say, but I do think it offers us a new direction, a new path to follow. Because heretofore, when people talked about instructional leadership, it was an academic term that was articulated in universities, and it made its way into the discussion of school improvement. But how to operationalize it has always been a struggle. And I think the kinds of things we're talking about here now, where you are looking at a principal who's responsible for the formative assessment on an ongoing basis, and understands that at the end of the day, that principal's evaluation is also dependent upon how successful the teachers are as well as the student. I think it does kind of change the nature and dynamics of the whole accountability formula.
All right, thank you very much. Any further?
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, next item then is our assessment update.
I'll be providing the assessment update today. I know you have a PowerPoint to put up. The reporting timelines for ISTEP are on track. We also anticipate giving you the preliminary aggregated data the week of June 26th, so that will be coming. iStar standard setting starts the middle of June for English Language Arts and Science and the end of June for Math and Social Studies. We'll formalize PLDs with educators, and then we'll recommend proficiency levels. I've mentioned this to you in the past, that we, instead of having pass plus, pass, and did not pass, the recommendation for iStar would be developing proficiency, meeting proficiency, and exceeding proficiency. This is the slide, you've seen it before. Again, it's just a reminder of the RFP process and the timeline. and we currently are still on track with our RFP process. For the approval for the RFP, we will work with the IDOA in early July, and we hope to have a formalized contract by late November or early December. If we can meet those timelines, we will again be on track. For the approval for the RFP committee, you can see on the left side members that we would like to have as part of this approval group. When you look at Department of Education staff, there will be a number of folks that will be reviewing the RFP, but at the very end, the DOE will only have one vote. It will be equal then to all the other members that will be on that RFP committee. That is done the same way that it's been done in the past. So next steps, we need to have superintendent and building administrator nomination process. DOE will review those and then they will select them by August 7th. And then we plan to review proposals in August or early September. Any questions about assessment? Perfect. And then Patrick, are you ready for ESSA?
Hi, everybody. I'll be quick. So I want to talk about three things as it relates to ESSA, give you a bit more of a report on the community meetings, go into a little more detail about the technical working groups. I know that some of you are serving on one of the technical working groups, so if you'd like to maybe talk a little bit about what they're talking about and who's there and what you've learned at that point, that would be great. And would like to revisit the timeline so that you all know when to expect things. So we had 9 community meetings in March and April. If you look at all of them, we had over 350 participants, administrators, parents, community leaders were in the community meetings. I'm still working on analyzing the feedback. There was a lot of footage to go through and a lot of we're looking through a lot of the posters as well, but that will be compiled in a report. And as I go through that, I'm feeding that up to our technical working group writers. So that is informing the writing of our state plan. In our technical working groups, so our groups are going to have 4 total meetings. They've had 2 so far. And we're looking at 1 meeting in June before we submit the first draft, and then another meeting in July so that they can take the comments received on the first draft and then provide some input on where we should go based on that feedback. Just as a reminder, the working group leads in accountability is Maggie Payno. And I'll also note that Maggie's doing a little bit of the school improvement piece of ESSA as well. Supporting excellent educators, Dr. Syverson is our lead there. Supporting all students, Nathan Williamson is the lead there, and he's working with a large set of DOE staff and community stakeholders in his working group because that section covers a lot of areas. And then Dr. Flores is responsible for the assessment section. And I'd like to talk a little bit about what the working groups are talking about. ESSA has a lot of choices if you sort of look at it as at a blank slate. But since we have some state structures in place, the number of choices we have are slightly more limited. So for example, in accountability, our groups are discussing some of the important elements that the state board will have to make rules on, including what the non-academic indicator will be, what our English language learner indicator will be, because those are both required under ESSA, and then how those will weight into our accountability system. And there will also be, the group's also talking about how we define targeted and comprehensive support, which are the 2 levels of support in ESSA. We also have to define and set goals for subgroups in ESSA. That's another requirement that we have, so that's something that ESSA will be looking at as a part of the accountability group. Would any of the board members who are serving in the accountability working group like to say anything about what's been discussed so far or anything of interest that's come up?
I will on assessment.
Okay.
I'm actually really excited about what's come out of the first two meetings. This second one, we've spent the entire time really talking about assessment literacy, which was a big piece that came out of the ISTEP panel. And I continue to say there were a lot of things that came out of that panel that then drove legislation that now is driving those discussions. And I'm most excited about the piece that not only would we have the check pluses, the blueprints from a state test standpoint, but the actual specifications. And that's something that we've not had and not really worked with educators to know how the questions were developed, why they were developed, what do you need to know to be able to ask those questions, and we were given a lot of examples to use, and really work through. And again, that group's a great group with a lot of diversity from teachers and all kinds of folks on there. And so I think that's been good, and I think we're coming to a very good place in terms of making sure that our stakeholders, meaning parents, teachers, kids, every community members know what we're testing, why we're testing it, how we're testing it, and so I have real positive thoughts coming out of what we've done so far on that portion.
I really appreciate that feedback. Others who have been in the group have want to talk about anything the group's discussed or consensus they've reached, perhaps. No pressure if you have anything to say.
You and I have talked. I may hold off.
Okay.
Until,
Sure.
we're still in the middle of discussing
Absolutely.
things, and I feel like we've made a lot of progress on accountability. Again, a great group of people. Maggie does a great job, and I appreciate her. I'm optimistic that we still have quite a few things to discuss, and
Absolutely.
so I don't want to color anything one way or the other.
We appreciate that, but I'm glad that the conversation is positive and that you have a lot to cover, and it sounds like you're getting there with all of the elements that you have to sort of touch on.
So yeah, we're working, and I appreciate, everybody's working and.
Yeah. Good. Thank you.
I was being diplomatic.
No, it's great.
Yes, you were.
It's great. It's absolutely great.
I love it. I'm optimistic, but we have more work to do. I love it. It's good.
But you do have a lot of decisions to make, and the recommendations will come forward, but I really appreciate that you've kept it deliberative and are kind of moving on with that. So Dr. Ernest talked a little bit about assessment. There aren't as many decisions to make on assessment because 1003, at least policy-wise, spells out what will go into the new assessment. But the transparency piece is something that Dr. Flores is really focused on, and it sounds like you guys are have a lot of really good ideas on kind of where you need to go with that. The Educator Effectiveness Group is looking at a variety of supports, the pre-service preparation piece, how to evaluate and support teachers, and then career pathways is also something that they're looking at. And obviously the student supports group has a lot of different areas to discuss, and they have to be, really diligent about the resources that are available and figure out exactly where we want to support and how, to what extent we want to dive deeper into some areas. I just, again, briefly want to go through what's guiding the group. We came up with a set of guiding principles in how we would like to approach writing this ESSA plan. And these were the 6 that we kind of normed all of the working groups on. In the decisions that we make, we kind of look at it through these lenses to make sure that what we believe to be high-quality principles for formulating this plan. We hope that things are student-centered, they're equitable. Transparency is obviously something we've stressed over and over again in terms of the process and ensuring that once we have it together that people know what's going on. We hope that the work needs to be aligned to each other. We can't just have pieces that are floating out there. It needs to make some sort of organized sense. Policy choices that are made in there have to be actionable. We can be aspirational, but we have to have a path forward in what we want to do. And they have to be focused too. There are so many different great areas to invest resources in, but unless they're focused, we're not actually going to achieve the goals that we set out. The first draft will be published on June 30th. We will have public feedback opportunities through July 31st. We're working on developing a companion survey to go with the state plan. These will be questions that the working group facilitators will develop, and they'll help guide the reader to the areas where we need additional input. Obviously, there can be input given on every part of ESSA, but there will be some decisions that won't be fully baked yet, if you will, when we get to the first draft. So we want to make sure that the areas where we need help, the public can provide us with direct, actionable feedback. The other thing that I'll note is that on the July 12th meeting, there will be a working group, a state board session, working session afterwards. We'll have all the working group leads here. They'll go through their sections and you can ask them questions. It's published on June 30th, and so you'll have about 10 or 12 days to review the pieces that you want to review, and then they'll be able to come and answer questions, and they'll walk through each section. I believe in being efficient in time, so we'll make sure that their comments are short, to the point, and allow for a lot of conversation and discussion based on the need and the will of the state board. And then finally, the timeline hasn't changed since we talked last time. We're in the writing the plan phase, where we're working with technical working groups and really developing that plan. The first draft, June 30th, it'll be out. We'll be accepting public comment through essentially the end of July. We will submit the plan to the governor's office on August 15th. He and his staff will have 30 days, more than 30 days, to review the plan, and then we will submit the final plan to the Department of Education September 18th. That's all I've got. Any questions? Yes.
I'm sitting on one of these committees, and it seems like we're looking at a set of policy issues, and you even mentioned policy in your presentation today. And one of the questions I have is, I thought the State Board of Education was to establish policy, and it seems like these groups are putting forth policy, and it is policy.
It is.
And so I'm a little confused. Can you clarify then, the role of State Board of Education in statute is to approve policy. And so in your timeline, I don't see any place where the State Board of Education votes on a number of policies. There's probably 20, 30 policies that are going to be presented before us. So how can something go forward from the state of Indiana signed by the governor if we have not approved those policies?
Well, I guess, and I'll have Leanne jump in here if she wants to, but a lot of the accountability pieces will need to be approved by the state board, and so we're trying to get to a place where we can make a recommendation, and then the board will then vote on the policy that they want to make. Leanne, do you want to?
So I see some of ESSA will be plans of action that DOE will take. For example, with school improvement, for years the department has provided school improvement, and under No Child Left Behind and now under ESSA, there really isn't a state board creating policy for that. But there are other areas, and I say that with a caveat, we do have some state law and some federal law, and eventually it would be nice if we would have them better aligned. And so that could certainly be something we add to our agenda in the future. But anywhere where I believe it certainly is a board authority with policies, when we write our ESSA plan, we would write that, here are, suggestions that we're going to take forward to the board. So it's not that we would be saying that this is exactly how it's going to be. We would spell out that board approval's needed, because they said we can always amend or add to our plan. So a plan is always a working plan. And so we would not put anything in that would be a policy without either spelling out that this needs board authority or being pretty vague, saying we're going to create that policy and add it to the plan.
So when you submit it to the U.S. Department of Education as a plan, they will come back and say, yes, it's approved, or no, it's not. You need to work on these specific kinds of things. So if there's a number of things in there that says you need board authority to go forward on all these policy things, is that as strong of a case as bringing something to us in advance that we could then probably approve? And so when you send it into the U.S. Department of Education, it's not a conditional plan, it's a plan that we have approved. We've approved those policies. So rather than saying we have to bring it before the board, why don't we do that in advance?
I would say any time that we would know those in advance to get them in front of you before we have to submit the plan, we certainly would do that. So I'll just keep challenging Patrick to look at those as they're coming up so that we can make sure we would bring those to the board. Some of those, the working groups are going on, they're currently still going on, and then by mid-July, we have to have it out to the public for public comments.
So I'm looking at the timeline. I don't see where State Board of Education is approving the policy parts of the ESSA plan. Where is that? Where is that in your timeline?
So we do have a review session July 12th so that you can review ESSA, and we can spell out where we think it probably requires state board approval at that session, at that working group session that we have on July 12th.
So July 12th, we're going to review the plan and then let you know what we think the policy is.
I'm not sure.
Which ones are policy and which ones aren't?
You'll have some recommendations.
Yeah, we'll have recommendations on where we believe state board action needs to be taken in terms of policy.
And how is policy interpreted? What's the definition of a policy? Well,
yes.
I'm looking at someone to give us some wisdom.
Yes, so the work session on July 12th, which will be after I think a relatively shorter meeting, will be to review, make comments on the ESSA plan, and have those discussions. It's not quite as simple as just saying policy. I mean, there are some things that the department as the SEA, they're responsible for, but there is a great deal of policy around accountability, assessment, things like that you're right, will have to be hashed out. So,
I've been intimately involved with this, and there's many policy considerations. I don't see us meeting on July 12th in the afternoon, have people present policy recommendations, and we're going to go through those and approve them. There's a lot of policy things in there. And frankly, as one person, I don't think it's a good idea to submit it to the U.S. Department of Ed saying, this is what we plan to do, but we need board approval.
I think that's one of the reasons why they will allow for amendments. So just as one example, when we amend our accountability rule, that's going to take time. There's a process that has to be followed, so there can't be a resolution of that until the rulemaking is concluded. So we're going to initiate rulemaking this summer, perhaps the next meeting or the meeting after that, and then begin that process. And so that's just one example.
So on July 12th, we're going to determine what is policy and what is not?
Sure, yes. To the best of our
I'm going to
ability.
hold you to it. It's really important because as I'm sitting in one of these committees, there's a lot of policy things happening. And I think people on the committee are thinking that whatever they decide is going to be it. And I think some of us are trying to sort of say there's another step.
I think the
in this
purpose of that,
process.
right, the purpose of that was to keep the board involved, informed, intimately so that when it gets to July 12th, we can hash out as many issues as possible. But there are going to be some lingering things that just aren't, that aren't going to be, the board can't decide before then, like accountability, how, exactly how assessment's going to look, perhaps, depending on how the pathways are going to, things like that. So I guess, I don't know if that answers your question, but
So just in general, we're not going to send anything forward in policy that has not been approved by the State Board of Education.
When I
Is that
say,
correct?
when we write it into the plan, it is, we've had group meetings, but the state board has the authority to vote on these areas. When we've received guidance from CCSSO, who have helped many other states already submit their plans, and every state have these same challenges. They have to have new policies, or they're anticipating some new law, and so the way you write it at a high level without as much detail, knowing that you're coming back and you'll spell it out once those policies or laws are in place.
And one thing I do is I can reach out to NASB as well and get their input, because I'm sure this is happening all over the place. So I'll do that.
I just want to be sure we're involved in the policy, because one of the few things we're responsible for is state policy. And there are statutes laid out where the State Board of Education is specifically named for doing that policy. However, there's many other policies that we should be considering and voting on that are not in state statute, particularly with ESSA. And so we just need to be sure to fulfill that responsibility that we do that. And I see you all agree, so I'm looking forward to July 12th.
Any other questions?
Just a comment, I've made this comment every month, and then bring to us, as was recommended, I don't remember the lady's name, a year ago, bring to us what ESSA requires. Don't bring us some grandiose plan that's way above and beyond what ESSA is requiring, because we can add that later if ESSA says we need to add more, but bring to us what ESSA requires.
So just one more point. ESSA, the timeline was brought to us. It was put on us by the feds. It wasn't one that we created. We have to have a plan submitted in September, or our federal funds would be in jeopardy. And we certainly don't want to put our state in that situation. And so with that, I would say our working groups have done a phenomenal job of, with the timeline we've been given and the good conversations they're having. And we know that there are other steps that need to go, such as state board reviewing and looking at different policies. So we know that's part of the process, and we're committed to make sure that we are all on the same page.
You just said State Board review. You didn't say State Board approval.
Well,
Did you mean to
so
say
approval of
review and
ESSA,
approval?
I would say, I don't know,
policy?
because it's really, the governor signs off on it, but my understanding is the state board doesn't have to approve the ESSA plan. We certainly would want your support with it. Am I correct with that?
So we keep talking past each other. That's why I'm pursuing it today at this late hour, that we're statutorily responsible for education policy in this state. So it isn't our job to review a plan created by DOE. It's our job to approve the policy.
Correct.
So it's review and approve.
Vince, do you have a question?
Well, I presume that there are going to be, we have current state law, we have current policy. If those, any part of those or a combination are included in the ESSA plan, they're already approved, right? They're not new policies.
Correct.
Not new laws that have to be created. It's just part of the plan based on current policy, correct?
Correct.
So any change would require either a legislative or a state board approval.
Correct.
So if you want to change the or the accountability system, for instance, just a broad, and it violates the law, it would take the General Assembly to approve that.
Correct.
Which then couldn't be done until next January, correct?
Correct.
Okay, so your suggestion, here's the framework, here's the ESSA plan in general, but here are the provisions within that plan that may need either legislative or state board approval.
That's correct.
Is that correct?
Yes.
Got it, all right.
So for example, graduation pathways, we have to talk about those. That's part of our new law. We have to talk
In the
about
plan.
those, but we can't define, we won't be ready to define those by the time we submit it in September. But we'll still identify that graduation pathways
Will be
are the way
included.
yes.
Got it. So the risk is, we make some claim that this would require approval and it doesn't get approved. So how we reconcile that becomes a real challenge for us, correct?
Well, that's when we would have to go back.
Or we get the
into
plan. Do you anticipate the U.S. Department of Education then approving that plan to move forward, or is it a provisional
So what-
approval, given that we are able then to do the legislative action, state board action we need?
That's really to be seen yet, isn't it? So do you know, the first group of states submitted, and they had, the U.S. Department of Ed have 180, what they say, working days with the plan. So what we've been told is after the review, after 20 days, if they have comments, when they send it back to the state to get additional clarification, that timeline stops. So the 180 days is with the U.S. Department of Ed. And so there will be that back and forth part of it as well.
Which buys time to get the approvals necessary.
Absolutely.
But the plan then we will mark anything that would need, again, either legislative or state board approval.
Yes.
In that plan. One of the things that I was, perhaps this is an indictment on my use of time, but I was watching C-SPAN, and I was watching the Senate hearing with the Secretary DeVos, and around the budget. There was a lot of conversation on ESSA. And her response multiple times was that if they meet the law, even if we disagree with it, if they meet the law, we would approve it. That was a question because there was a lot of questions around how are you going to use federal policy, federal funds to direct or drive policy at a state or local level. And the response was, if they meet the law, then it will get approved. I'm with Dr. Yeager as well. I wouldn't put anything out there that goes beyond that. And I would also encourage, and I know we've had this discussion at the board level a number of times, that we're able to create the greatest amount of flexibility for our schools and our state as possible within this plan. I presume we're going to, but I would hope that it doesn't become overly restrictive, but rather very flexible. It gives us a chance to come back and really decide how we want to move education in the state of Indiana. So,
well stated. Well stated. And I did neglect to say one thing, thanks to Patrick and Leanne and Maggie and all the people involved with this ESSA work, and board members as well. You're doing great work, and we do appreciate the extra efforts you're doing.
We skipped the Technical Advisory Committee update.
Was that intentional?
No, it was, the next item up was the ESSA, and I think we just slid right into it. It's a one-page memo, so hopefully
Yeah,
one page
it's-
is very short.
It's quick and easy. There was the TAC provided a formal memo regarding the core assessments, so you can read that and see what the recommendations are. So there's an official memo. And on top of that, tomorrow afternoon, we have a conference call with the TAC to discuss the post-equating of ISTEP, which is essentially a nice sign that things are moving forward, which is what you need to hear.
All right, that being said,
So moved.
do we need volunteers for the Pathways Committee?
I think people could just volunteer,
Just submit those names to the state board staff?
just send them to some.
Great.
Send them to me if you want them, send them to Brian, whoever. Make sure I can know who's volunteering, and we'll get something scheduled.
All
Okay.
right, then, motion to adjourn?
Yes.
So moved.
Yep.